My name is Mark Nelson. I'm the Senior Director for the Center for International Media Assistance here at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm really happy to welcome you to our conversation this afternoon in celebration of World Press Freedom Day. We're delighted to have so many friends of NED and SEMA here with us and some new people in the room, and we look forward to meeting you afterwards when we have a reception to talk about what we've heard here today and to meet each other and discuss our findings. One of the really great things about working at the National Endowment for Democracy and having SEMA in this context of the National Endowment for Democracy is that we have this steady group of talented and dedicated people who come through as fellows of the Reagan-Fussell Democracy Program. These fellows who come from all kinds of professions, from civil society, government, academia, are most important for today, of course, from the media. Are a real resource for us at SEMA and have been contributors to our blogs and to our understanding about what's going on in the rest of the world. And we thought it would be a good thing for us today to bring some of these fellows together, to bring those insights to you so that everybody could hear what they've been saying about what's happening in the world in the field of media freedom. We've had a really impressive cohort in the last couple of years, and you see some of them on the stage today. And we're really happy they're going to be sharing their knowledge and insights with us. Over the past week, as I'm sure you know, both Freedom House and the Reporters Without Borders have released their latest figures on media freedom. And Freedom House, for example, noted that for the past 13 years in a row, media freedom has declined. So we're in this really downward spiral that is really affecting the conditions for media freedom across the world. And many of these features of declining media freedom are shared across borders. And we thought it would be interesting for us today to bring this group of people together to talk about what's going on in their parts of the world and the many and complex challenges that they're facing, and the regional and even global similarities that we're starting to see in these challenges to media freedom. I'm happy to turn over the microphone to my colleague Shanti Kalotil, who is the director of the Forum for Democratic Studies, who's going to be moderating for us today, and she's going to be introducing our panelists one by one. So I look forward to chatting with you after the event at the reception. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Before we get started, I wanted to just draw your attention to the screen behind us and to a few of the hashtags that you can use if you are planning to follow this or contribute to the conversation on social media. There's hashtag MediaDev, there's, they went away. There's also hashtag WPFD 2017, which is for World Press Freedom Day 2017. I bring this up partly to encourage you to do that, and also partly just to maybe segue into some of the themes of our conversation, which is in following this hashtag today, I was struck by the richness of the conversation happening on social media around that hashtag. And what we'd like to do today is to try to explore some of the themes that I saw popping up on that today, including relating to some of the really fundamental aspects of press freedom and media development, including the legal environment, the issue of media capture, the dynamics presented by new and online media. So I think we'll have a great conversation. You already should have the bios of all of our incredibly stellar panelists and participants here today, so I won't go into their biographies, but I will briefly name them so you know who's who. Here we have Raul Peñaranda. Next to him is Cesar Recaurte. Next is Asif Robi. Next is Semenish Mengesha, she goes by Lily. Next, Nawaf Haskan and James Smart. So as you can see, we have a big group today. We won't do this in the traditional style where we all go through and have a traditional panel. We really want to have a conversation and then quickly try to open it up so that everybody can get involved in the conversation. So one of the major themes that I noticed people were talking about today in the context of World Press Freedom Day was this idea of how the law and enabling environment is one of the main factors conditioning press freedom. And certainly if you have repressive laws in place in your country, it's really almost impossible to do anything constructive under that environment. So I was hoping that some of you could maybe talk about that environment in your own country and go into a little bit of detail about how that's affected the environment for the press. So Cesar, would you be able to start us off?
Thank you, Shanti. Yes. Thank you for coming. As in other Latin American countries with authoritarian populist regimes, the situation of freedom of expression in Ecuador since the arrival of Rafael Correa has deteriorated seriously. Thus, in the last Freedom House report on freedom of expression in Ecuador appears as non-free country. The report of the Office of the Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Expression of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights published 22 pages to describe violations of this right in the last year. Last Monday, Ecuador submitted to the Universal Periodic Review within the United Nations Council, Human Rights Council, 26 states explicitly request that Ecuador repeal or revise the organic law of communications, as well as legislation restricting the work of civil society. The law of communication is a product of a war the government of Rafael Correa declared against the independent media. From the moment of his ascension to the presidency of the Republic, when he declared that the journalists were all corrupt and mediocre, who were the enemies of the revolution. 4 years ago, the law has approved and resulted in 483 sanctions against journalists, newspapers, radio stations, television stations, and social organizations. The result is as self-censorship has grown. The media are limited by published corruption investigations, and it's the lawyers, not the journalists, who make the final decisions in the newsrooms of the media outlets.
Roby, you had previously mentioned that you had also noticed some of the laws in your country were having quite a significant effect. You'd mentioned the ICT law. Could you maybe go into a little bit of detail about that?
Okay, actually for Bangladesh there are three kinds of law that has been practiced for many years. First is sedition law, that is anti-state conspiracy, and second is defamation law, and third one is ICT Act. And most interestingly, three of the act has common theme, that they are starting with that if your words is hurting anybody, then with one law you will be in lifetime imprisonment, with other law you will be from 7 years to 15 years in imprisonment. So the most practices law that used against journalist or any independent blogger is ICT Act. And it means that in your digital media, if you write something or say something that hurts anybody's feeling, that you can be sent to jail from 7 to 14 or 15 years, and this is non-bailable offense. That without any proof, police can come to you and say you have done this and this thing, and they can arrest you and they can send you for 7 to 15 years. So this is the thing. But on this very day, like World Press Freedom Day, I want to give one good news and one bad news. The good news is that just yesterday, last night, our law minister, he declared that Bangladesh government is going to delete or remove the ICT Act law. And the bad news is that, as I am journalist, so I am always looking for bad news. So bad news is that he added at the end of his discussion that anyway, to maintain the discipline, we are going to prepare a new Digital Act law. So you can understand the gravity of this good news and bad news. So hope
Yes.
for the best.
So the ICT law is dead. Welcome to the new digital law,
Law,
right?
yeah.
So when we talk about law, it's usually not just about a specific law or law, but also the broader enabling environment that conditions how the laws are used and whether or not they may be enforced. Lily, you had mentioned that the state of emergency was a big factor in the enabling environment in Ethiopia. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, thank you. So before the state of emergency, ever since the 2009 anti-terrorism law was introduced, it's on, I think, it's on. So yeah, ever since the 2009 anti-terrorism law was introduced, the terrorism charges have been systematically used against journalists. Not it was a safe haven before that, but it was not as systematic and the attack was not as organized as it is now. So since the anti-terrorism law, at least 30 journalists have been charged and imprisoned, and more than 30 journalists in 1 year, in 2014 alone, were forced to be in exile. Physical threats, arbitrary detention and convictions still happen to silence the media. So with all this, what could go wrong is the state of emergency, as you mentioned. I say that the state of emergency is basically an overextension of the anti-terrorism law we had before it was imposed, giving a much broader definition and giving the police, and in this case of state of emergency, the command posts the legal leverage to take extensive measures against any critical view. So what has been happening is it restricted any messaging, communication through internet, mobile, in writing, television, any means of communication. Websites, social media that used to be randomly blocked were completely shut down. Even it makes watching some diaspora-based satellite media such as ISAT and OMN that are legally registered and based in the US illegal. But most importantly, the command post is given an authority to arrest anyone without a court warrant or to keep in detention without even presenting them to court. So this increased the fear among people, fear among journalists, fear among the people. And now people don't even want to talk to the media about anything. People fear to talk about politics. People fear to post on social media. Even people who used to be vocal to speak to the media, like politicians, opposition party members, or university lecturers, stopped doing so after the state of emergency. So you can imagine that right now the biggest challenge is access to information, and we have reached to a point that we don't even get information anymore.
I think that's a really important point, that it's not just about laws and restrictive laws, but this knock-on effect that they have all the way down the line. And so in the end, it's really the broad freedom of expression throughout society that's affected, and everyday people can be afraid to speak as well.
Exactly.
Another major issue that we've been talking about with respect to the current threats to press freedom and media systems is the outright capture of media outlets by special interests. And I know many of you have had experience with that and have studied that. Raul, I was wondering if you could maybe talk about your own experience and your view.
Excellent. Thank you, Shanti, and thank you to everybody for being here and being interested, showing your interest in this very important date, freedom of expression. Yes, we don't have the problems that, for example, Ethiopia, in Bolivia, or Ecuador have, those very restrictive laws. But we have other kind of problems. For example, this capture of the media. For example, the government has used tons of public advertisement to co-opt the media. The government has $150 million per year to give to the media outlets in Bolivia. For a country which is poor with a very small economy, $50 million is a big amount to keep those media outlets like under control. So that's one way. The other is that businessmen related to the government are buying some media outlets too. And also all this harassment, verbal attacks against journalists, all this kind of very aggressive attitudes against the press also have an impact, because in a way, not maybe as grave as in Ethiopia, some people don't want to talk to certain media outlets. For example, specialists or academics or whatever, they don't want to be themselves threatened, so they also avoid to speak to the very few independent media outlets that we have in Bolivia.
And you'd mentioned that certain businesses had bought these media outlets. Are they being told by the government exactly what to publish, or is it more of just an understanding that they're all on the same page?
Very interesting, because one of the businessmen that has been buying media outlets in Bolivia is a Venezuelan businessman called Carlos Gil, that had important relations with Hugo Chavez before and now with the Maduro government in Venezuela and also in Bolivia. But the thing is that Carlos Gil has other important businesses in Bolivia. So he has bought other kind of companies and has other things going on, and he uses the media as giving a favor back to the government. So the government allows him to do other businesses, but the media that he controls changed in the recent years, the executive staff, and now those media outlets are very pro Evo Morales government. So it's like having another business that he's really interested, but only having the media as a trade-off.
Yeah, that's a fascinating dynamic, and I think you see that play out in other situations, other countries as well. Nawaf, I know that you had mentioned previously when we were discussing some of these issues that the idea of media capture is salient in Iraq as well. Could you go into some more detail?
Yeah, so in Iraq we kind of have all the problems that other people have. So there was a famous joke in 1990s among journalists. They would say, he said, American journalists meet Iraqi journalists. American journalists said, in America you can't say anything about the president of America, nobody will do anything to you. And the Iraqi journalists tell him, yes, it's same thing. It's true. You can say anything about the American president in Iraq. Nobody would do anything to you. So it's that. But now the things become more complicated. Now you cannot talk about. Even still in Iraq, and also the other country influence. Like if you say something about, for example, the president of Iran or president of Turkey, because there is like the regional influence about that. But we were talking about the legal issue. So beside the security issue, the legal issue is there is the good news. There is a space for media, and there is a law for giving to the journalists and to the freedom of expression. There is actually 2 articles consist of 19 sections. That's one good news. The bad news of that side, it's since 1925 when the constitution of Iraq has been put in place, and then been changed at least 6 times since then. And every time, if you follow the law of journalism that focus on the freedom of expression and the media, there has been a layer added to that law to restrict the more freedom of expression. So what we have right now in Iraqi constitution, we can have a contradiction between the laws. So this new law give you a more a rights, a space to have actual freedom of expression, but all the there is 12 other articles and acts that still exist or still active from the previous constitution that restricts the freedom of expression. So as a journalist, I can be ended up in jail not because of the new law in the new constitution, but based on the other law. That's one of the things. And the other things like we are facing is it's the independency of media. The environment, like one of the the journalist professional actually is a professor at Baghdad. He said he looked at the political party and media being like a mutual blackmail. That's how he described it. So you have affiliated political media with the political parties. So a journalist can ended up in a jail, not based on like you have a committee of you have different department of journalism or things like that, not a decision made by them, but a decision made by the head of the political party. So that's also like a problem we are facing in Iraq.
So it's not just businesses, but media captured by specific political parties
Yeah,
and interests.
yeah.
Mhm.
That's also.
So we had mentioned a little bit now in this context the role of government advertising and how influential that can be. And James, I know you recently wrote a blog post for SEMA that touched on that. I was wondering if you could go into more detail about that.
Absolutely. I think in Kenya we've gone a step further. We've explored everything that Bolivia has done in terms of getting the government to advertise in the media. But we've gone a step further in finding out else how the government can in fact have its own paper and its own infrastructure. So the Kenyan government, after 4 years of trying to buy, advertisement and remove the pressures from critical media by, removing adverts from these critical media houses, decided that it's good to try and have its own infrastructure of, advertise inside those newspapers and remove, advertisement in terms of what we give to those media houses. So this obviously, brings an alarm to those people who are working and as journalists in Kenya have seen an increased pressure of working in the newsroom. So since it's a business that is suffering, the government finds it's a good way to hold journalists accountable by saying, look, you are not playing ball, you're writing things that are not in line with government development record, which is something that the current Kenyan government really wants to talk about its development record against, critical, press or any other critical output. So everyone else is trying to go back into this development reporting because that's in there, that's where you can get the government revenues for you to survive. So most Kenyan journalism today is about how journalists can survive, how they can put, themselves in a place of financial stability, as opposed to finding out what's, critical in the country. How do you report on government spending? How do you report on corruption? How do you report on, officials who are spending government money? And that is something that has been achieved by and large by the government deciding to have its own infrastructure of how to get to the public, bypass the media by essentially creating its own way of reporting to, and people don't have to read this newspaper at all. It's called MyGov. They don't have to, but the fact that the media doesn't get that revenue, it works the magic. It gets the point across.
That's a really important point to draw the link between the financial sustainability of media and whether or not media can be seen as a viable business, and draw that link between that and freedom of expression and actual the independence of the media. Frequently we talk about these issues like sustainability and business models and business development, but that's certainly not in a vacuum. I think your piece and what you've just said now really shows how clearly those issues are connected, that whether or not journalists feel like there's a steady income can relate to what they feel like they're able to report on. Lily, you'd also mentioned that the financial capacity of media was an important issue in Ethiopia.
Yes. The legal restrictions and repressions I mentioned earlier are just an addition to the long-standing tactics of economically weakening independent media. So we have this structure of government-aid media and private media. So what we call the government media are the state-owned medias. In Ethiopia, the broadcast media is completely under the control of the state, so it's funded by the state. And that leaves the private media to provide the independent news. But this private media get its money mostly from advertisement. And they get their advertisement based on the content they have. Because business tend not to give advertisement to newspapers that have a political content or a critical view, because they fear for their own business, obviously. So there is this trend of seeing the media as a political tool and associating it with just politics. So people don't want to even be associated with media organizations. And on top of that, newspaper publishers struggle with very expensive office rents, very high printing costs that keeps increasing due to double taxation on paper and ink. This makes it hard for publications to increase their copies and circulate beyond the capital city. So all the newspapers we have are now within the capital city, which doesn't cover more than 85% of the population. So they cannot increase their circulation, they cannot depend on income from selling the newspapers, and it's very difficult to get advertisements if they want to be more open and critical in their content.
Nawaf, did you have thoughts about how this relates to Iraq?
Yeah, it is. That's also somehow very true in Iraq. Yeah, I mean, media as a business. If you look at the media as a business in Iraq, it's not successful, because also like business people somehow they will avoid to publish their stuff in certain newspapers or certain media outlets, because if you're a independent business person and businessman or woman in there, and you're trying to publish, advertise for your business for exchange of funding that newspaper, and if that newspaper, some like the people run the newspaper affiliated with the political, that's mean you are also affiliated indirectly with that political party. So I think that's the lack of independence of media make also the businessman like to avoid, except if they have like future political intention to run for an office or to do something. And in terms of like the newspapers, same thing is true. For example, we have one of the biggest newspaper, most popular newspaper in Baghdad. It's called Al-Sabah, the morning, and it being funded by one of the by a company from US. I think it's called Harris, the company in US. So it's been funded for a long time by that. Because if that newspaper tried to be funded by any of the political parties or like any people in they has to serve not the mission of this newspaper. You know, they have to say what somebody else wants them to say. That's a struggle between where you get your fund from and what you want to say.
So what a lot of you have been getting at is the idea that all these issues are quite interrelated, and that it's important to don't look at them in isolation, but also to look at how the whole media and information ecosystem is connected. Raul, could you talk a little bit about that in the Bolivian context?
Excellent, thank you, Shanti. Yes, I think that we have to pay attention to one thing, is that authoritarian governments, and we have, I think, at least 4 here. I don't know if maybe Iraq and Kenya, they do have a democracy, you do, but the rest of us, we are in a very different kind of context, and I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. In Bolivia, for example, Evo Morales is in his 11th year in power, in his 3rd term. His 3rd term that he's running now, or his 3rd administration, is against the Constitution, because the Constitution says that he could be in power only 2 terms, okay? But he made the Constitutional Court to interpret what 2 terms mean, and they interpreted that there was 3, okay? So it's true. So now he's in his 3rd term, and he wants to run for a 4th term. So I think that the media in this context, when we suffer pressures and harassment, etc., is because we push back. Is because we are kind of the sector of society that can really put an obstacle to these authoritarian regimes. I think that authoritarian presidents have like 2 obstacles to kind of defeat. One is the judiciary, and that's why they co-opt the judiciary or control the judiciary in most of the cases. And second is the press. The press is the sector that can really push back to those ideas, strategies of maintaining power and not stepping down. So the president Morales is in his 3rd term, maybe he's going to be in 4th, etc. So I think that's one of the problems that we share with many other countries.
And Roby, you had also mentioned that this sort of whole ecosystem is important to look at. How does that, what's your view on that in your country?
Yeah, my view is that like terrorism or the several legal act, they are not the biggest enemy of the free press. I think the biggest enemy of the free press is the systematic control over the whole media ecosystem, and the whole thing is quite unofficial. Like in the law, anyone can publish newspaper, but we know in the reality that people who are trusted people by the government, by the party, only those people are given license for TV station or newspaper. Also, government has good control over the revenue system. Even the private company or corporate, if they want to give advertisement to any newspaper, and those newspaper is very critical to government, then there are unofficial pressure on those corporations because they have many issue with tax and business environment, so they will not give advertisement to those news outlet. And very interestingly, in the distribution channel, like if you pass first two challenges that you are owner of a newspaper and you don't care about the revenue, but you cannot distribute it because the local cable operator, one day will you will not see in your neighborhood CNN, and you cannot blame government because they didn't ban CNN in Bangladesh. They will say, oh, it's a local cable operator problem because local cable operator, they have their own union, and the newspaper distributor hawkers, they have their own union, and those unions are very much controlled by the government. They are influenced by the government. So this is very, I would say that this is very smart enemy of the free press in our context, and I think this is the biggest enemy because if you go out of this ecosystem, if you want to act out of this ecosystem, you will be the most isolated person or journalist in the country. You will not get any job. You cannot you cannot live yourself. So it makes a big difference between the truth and the accurate truth. If you go Bangladesh and ask my colleagues, is press of Bangladesh are free? They will say yes. We have full freedom. So this means a lot. This makes a big difference between the accurate information, accurate truth, and the real truth.
Yeah, James, you had a...
Just to buttress the point that Rob is making, I think that almost every business model that journalism has tried, especially in our case, is almost failed. And unless you have a strong business person who's a benefactor, or you have government advertising. And because journalism is expensive to produce, and unless the people, the citizens, are paying for it, then that's where you can have something to go back on. Because if you're going to go after dictators, demagogues and rabble-rousers and people who say half-truths and all these things, these people usually are very smart, and they have a lot of money to spend, and they can always go after individual journalists and go after the business of journalism in itself. So I think at the end of the day, the saving grace would be the people, the citizens themselves, to start realizing that they have to pay for good journalism.
Well, I think a lot of people in the media would second your point, probably. This is usually the point when we start talking about all these intractable issues where people typically bring up the advent of online media, new media, saying that maybe this has the potential to break through some of those previous log jams. And I'm curious as to your experience with that. Cesar, you had indicated that maybe this might be an area where there was some freedom possible.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the communication law in Ecuador has had a serious consequences for the traditional media. Important medias, important newspaper as the Diario Hoy of Quito or Revista Vanguardia closed. The disappearance of traditional media and censorship has caused the most recognized journalists in the country to enter the digital environment and create their own media. This is not necessarily negative, but no of this media is guaranteed to survive. And the hostility and creative forms of censorship implemented by the Ecuadorian government, as documented in recent report of the Human Rights Clinic of George Washington University Law School. Ecuadorian officials is very creatively control digital and social media through using the USA Digital Millennium Copyright Act. This make it possible to unsubscribe and censor notes that include image of President Correa or the public buildings. Yes, this shutdowns of the web's page.
So there are opportunities, but also some traditional restrictions. James, you've done a lot of work with social media. I know you use it a lot. What's been your experience there in that sphere?
I certainly think that social media, new media, is a saving grace. The fact that with a switch of a button, anyone and everyone can be a publisher and a broadcaster at a go. So that's a beautiful thing. One of the key and important, I think, journalism that I've seen in Kenya started on social media, where individuals who have a little bit of training, have nothing but a phone, a smartphone, have gone out and been able to film, 2-3 minutes and use graphics, and then buttress that with a blog, and the information is out all of a sudden. And the fact that these are people who can be able to do it, and with little or minimal training, has also been able to shield the people in the newsroom in many ways, because the information is already out and people are already talking about it. And so the media can always get it as a day two reporting and say, well, people are already talking about it, it's a matter of public interest, so we can get on it and report on it. That is one part. The other part is the fact that since everyone can say anything and online, then creates the next problem that everyone has to deal with. That's fake news. Then we cannot trust what whoever said, and we don't have any controls how to verify and how to find out whatever has been said. How can we, all of a sudden, run and find that? And the problem of good journalism is it will take just a long time for you to verify certain things, which are important to, there could be claims that anyone can say on the face value, there's a video that I've seen and it is true and everyone has seen it, but then most certainly there's usually a story within a story. And that's what journalism is all about, to provide context, to give the whole aspect of what we know and how we know it. And for what I've seen, there's a report out today that many journalists in the newsrooms, especially from Africa, are online 90% at least. And they're there because they're required to be there. But almost half of them, my colleagues and myself, face harassment. You face trolling online, and for my female colleagues, it's sexual harassment. And all this comes from political reporting. It mostly doesn't come from someone who did a very good piece on agriculture, a fantastic piece, on how vehicles are made, and that sort of thing. It comes from political reporting. So it means there's something there that either we are in a section where the public, only reads about the things that, or views that they care about. And so they're, everyone is really, defending their point of view. And you're coming up with another piece that does not conform with their view. They attack the person that is you. And so most journalists today are facing a situation whereby you have to defend the person that is you, as opposed to the product that you put out consistently. And people engage you on how you know what you know, but engage you on you are belonging to this side or that side, and you're fighting the president as a person, and Caesar would support that.
Yeah, I think there's been a conflation with the news and the personality, and it's no longer so easy to distinguish. Lily, you also have some experience.
Yes. So social media, digital media in general, is very new to Ethiopia. Not only that it is new, access is also access to internet is a big problem. Less than 2% of the population have access. We have close to 100 million population now, and less than 2% have access to internet. That being as it is, those of us who have access to it used to think it's immune to all these restrictive laws we have before 2014. But then in 2014, with the crackdown the government had against not only journalists but also bloggers and social media activists, we found that like social media is also targeted with these restrictive laws, and we have many of them charged with terrorism and are still in prison. Having said that, though, I believe that digital media is a new platform and it's a digital era, and especially here in diaspora, we are having many media initiatives that are using this platform to carry out the job of informing citizens, and many are using this as a source of information. So probably this could go as a recommendation to the international community where they can support financially and technically, because as James mentioned, there is a big gap of like which information is true, like how do you bring out the information and how do you exercise the citizen's journalism, and to bring in some sort of responsibility, there should be at least some sort of training to those established media initiatives. I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, Raul?
Well, of course, digital media is the future, and I think that it brings us many, many opportunities. It is cheaper, to print, comparing to print a newspaper, etc. But also, I think that the business model is missing also to really finance the digital media. In Bolivia, also, we have a kind of a different thing. Social networks, what they do is to take links from traditional media, for example, Página 7, a daily, that has a web page and runs a story about corruption, whatever. So that there's a link, and the link is then distributed by thousands on social networks. So it's like an islands. We have these islands between the traditional media that has web pages with the users of social networks. So I think that that's very important. The web page per se, or the newspaper itself, it doesn't have the capacity of reaching many people. But when it's taken by the users of social networks, it can be massively distributed. I think that that alliance is very, very important and healthy.
Well, that's a good, I was going to ask all of you if you had, since we had been focusing so much on all these negative aspects, I was wondering if you had any positive stories to share about your experience, whether they're positive trends or whether perhaps some projects that you're working on that might be something on the other side of the coin. So, Raul, that's one.
Exactly, that's one.
Anybody else want to share something about
that? I think that in the context like my country, digital media, there lies a big hope, and I think the business model depends on the internet penetration. When there is 13% internet penetration, you cannot expect a big business or revenue over them. So I think the Western world can help Bangladesh for free internet everywhere. They can provide free internet, and we can provide the free information, and this free internet and free information can make a good business model. And this is very interesting to see that Freedom House published a report on Bangladesh press media. They say that the press media freedom is 0, but internet freedom is partly free. So here lies the hope of an independent media, I think, with good people, good journalists, and with good support. And if we can develop a business model where we will not invest on the newspaper, but we will invest on the internet penetration, high internet penetration in the village area, all over the country, in the root level, then it can produce more revenue, and it can be very good prospect and business model for any country like our context.
Roby, I think if you can develop a profitable internet news business model, you'll have a lot of potential investors here. So, James, you wanted to share something?
Well, just perhaps very quickly. I mean, Kenya's going for an election in less than 3 months, and we're seeing a good relationship that is building up between an informed public that is very engaged online and newsrooms and journalists who are receiving a battering from the government. So how it works is, we had a president who used to spend almost 7 days a week outside the country. And so people dubbed him, the president who tours Kenya every so often. And so this discussion started on social media, and social media was at it every day, taking pictures, showing every time when president is leaving and, when he's coming, and putting up, sort of like a timetable, So this guy's been away for 2 days, then he comes back for a few hours, then he leaves again. And that conversation at that time that picked up in social networks helped the Kenyan newsrooms to start talking about this and really just talk about the cost of these travels and what that the public is getting out of this, because the government would say, well, we're going out to get businesses, and sign deals and that sort of thing, and so without social media, no one in the newsroom would have started having that discussion, because immediately would have been labeled, someone who's an opposition or that sort of thing. But thanks to social media and that relationship that is building up with an engaged public that is concerned, it's helping journalists to get to what is important and sort of hiding in public, which is a good thing, which never existed before, I think.
That's good to hear. Yes, Noah?
Yeah, I will say one positive about Iraq. I mean, Iraq, it's the fourth largest country in terms of population in Arab region, and somehow I see the Iraq as one of the most robust domestic markets for the media and press, and for that reason we see many international media focusing on Iraq because of all the thing going on. And then what happens, the connection that happened, so most of these international media will at least hire 1 or 3 people, like technician or like media technician or media worker from Iraq, and that connection make people there have more knowledge about how the independent media should look like. And then I've seen within the civil society and the media, the journalists, there is like a push for more independent media. I think that's something we're going through.
That's great. Just to wrap up this part of the conversation, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how, since some of you have brought this up already, in your view, how could the international community best support you and other independent journalists in your work?
It's a very good question, and I think that what the international cooperation could do is to help to finance new media and probably new digital media. I think that there are many ways that the international community can help, training and others, but I think that helping reporters to establish blogs or other kind of website related to, of course, news that are relevant for that country. I think that because we're missing the business model. It's hard for those digital media to raise some money. So I think that one possibility for the international community is to help finance those kind of initiatives.
Okay.
Thank you. I think that we are not the ones on the stage. I don't think we are alone on the fight. We shouldn't be all about talk, and we should start to see some action. Look at Eritrea, for example. All these 2 decades long reports that have been coming out from the international community, and we still have journalists who are in prison for the last 17 years. We don't even know if they are alive. So first of all, I really want the international community to do a self-check on the precedents they set. Countries that have been defending and protecting press freedom should continue to do so. I mean, the media is globally under attack and it's losing its trust. And we are already we on the stage are already the living examples on how states do not achieve without the democratic institutions functioning. Probably it's time that the world learns something from us. And so we should not lose the media legitimacy, and we should not lose its role, because it will be like losing all the balance we have. So I want the international community to make sure that the bar for free press stays up high, and that the countries who want to hold us to that bar also lead by example. And secondly, this development and security partnership should not happen at the expense of human rights and attacking democratic institutions. I think it's incentive to the international community if these countries remain stable, and I believe that free press is an indicator for political stability. Another point I want to make is, in the Ethiopian context, my government spent a huge amount of money for surveillance, and it buys these surveillance equipments from the West. So I want the international community to push companies and these countries to stop selling these equipments to countries like Ethiopia to censor its own citizens. And I mentioned it earlier that the digital platform is a new future, and I see a lot of hope in that. So the international community again can help in financially and technically on that.
Okay, that's important points. Raul, you had a quick point to add?
No. Sorry, I'm okay. Thanks.
Does anybody else want to add something here about the international community's role?
I want to add a single line that please consider that press freedom is not a local problem. It's not a zonal problem. If anywhere in the world the press face challenges, it's a challenge for all the world. It's a global challenge. Thank you.